Hi, everybody. My name is Curtis Mitch, and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're going to have a short reflection today on today's Mass readings for Monday, July 6th. And we're going to focus in on today's Gospel reading, which is Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 through 26. Today's reading presents us with two stories about two people who bring their suffering to Jesus. And these stories are actually unique because they're interlaced. One story is woven into the other story. And it seems a very simple story on the surface. But in point of fact, these few verses, these two brief accounts of encounters with Jesus, are actually quite deep. In fact, we're going to look at the Old Testament a little bit and see some of the background and see just how rich in meaning, how heavy with meaning are these two short stories. Now, I'm tempted to say that these stories tell us about the power of faith, but in one sense that would be imprecise because they're really about the power of Jesus when we come to him in faith. That's when astonishing things happen. Jesus' power isn't limited, but sometimes our faith is. But what happens when that faith is active? What happens when that faith reaches out to Jesus? That's when God's grace really begins to pour into our lives. Now, what is the power of Jesus in these two episodes? It's twofold. It shows us that Jesus has the power to raise the dead and the power to heal the sick. He has authority over death and authority over sickness as well. So let's just read this account because it's very short, and then we'll try to isolate a few of the lessons that are there for us. We're reading in Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 18. While Jesus was speaking to them, behold, a ruler came and knelt down before him, saying, "My daughter has just died. But come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus rose and followed him with his disciple. And behold, a woman who had suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. For she said to herself, "If I only touch his garment, I shall be made well." Jesus turned and seeing her, said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. And when Jesus came to the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a tumult, he said, "Depart, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl rose. And the report of this went throughout all of that district. So you've got a couple of things going on here. First, you have a ruler who approaches Jesus and says that my daughter has just died. So the grief of this moment is really just now beginning to hit him, right? He's a bereaved father, and he thinks that Jesus can help in some way, which is kind of remarkable because if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has not yet performed any resurrection miracles up to this point. Okay, he has healed the sick, and he has cast out demons, and he has given us powerful teaching, but he has not yet shown his authority over death. And so why does this ruler think that Jesus might be able to do something about a daughter who just passed away, a daughter who just died? Well, because he's probably informed by the traditions of Israel. And in the Old Testament, we have stories of the prophets of Israel doing this very thing. We have stories of prophets bringing children, in particular, back to life, okay? If you were to turn back to 1 Kings chapter 17, you would read a story about Elijah raising the young son of a woman from Phoenicia. And then his successor, the prophet Elisha, also raises a young person from the dead in 2 Kings chapter 4. All right, so this is something that the great prophets of Israel do. They're not just spokesmen for God. They don't simply speak the word of God, although they certainly do that. they're also channels of the power of God. God's power to bring life to the dead flows through his prophets. And Jesus was perceived in this way by his contemporaries, right? We learned this earlier last week whenever we read Matthew 16, and Jesus asked the disciples who he was, and he said, and the disciples responded to him, well, some say John the Baptist or Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So Jesus was perceived as one of these great and powerful prophets of the people of Israel, one through whom God's power was flowing into the world. Now, Jesus says something. He responds immediately. He doesn't respond in words. He simply follows the ruler back to the house, and he sees the house surrounded by mourners, right? The flute players and the crowds making a tumult, right? And what does Jesus say? He says, depart, go away. Okay, clear out. Why? Because the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him for saying this. Now, why would Jesus make this point? Is he saying that the child didn't actually die? No, she did die. And the ruler was confident of that fact. So why would he say it this way? Why would Jesus say, the girl is not dead but sleeping? Well, on the one hand, it's sort of at a surface level, you could say that Jesus is making the point that this condition is temporary, that this tragic loss of life is about to be reversed. It's as though she is sleeping, right? And just simply needs to be awake. Well, that might be true at the surface, but I think there might be something deeper going on here as well. Because the whole concept of waking from sleep is actually, when you go back to the Old Testament, is also the language of resurrection. Okay? In Isaiah 26, which is probably the first clear indication that God is going to raise up his people from the dead. In Isaiah 26, the dead are referred to those who dwell in the dust, and God will raise them up. But later on, in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 12, that language changes a little bit. Instead of those who dwell in the dust being raised up, Daniel describes it as those who sleep in the dust. They will be awakened, and some will go to everlasting life and others to everlasting condemnation. But the idea that the whole concept of sleeping and waking is something very closely associated to Israel's faith in a general resurrection of the body. All right, and Jesus is kind of hooking into this tradition. He's evoking this by speaking of her death as a form of sleeping from which she will be awakened. All right. And so this young girl, what we have here in her resurrection, Jesus simply touches her and life comes back into her, is an advanced glimpse, or you might say a theatrical preview of the general resurrection of the dead that God's people were already hoping in, even though it wasn't clear to them that the Messiah would be the first to raise from the dead. He would be the first fruits of those who have gone down to the dead, and he will live again. So that's the first miracle Jesus performs. The second is related to the woman who touches the fringe of his garment. Now, the woman has a chronic medical condition, right? A condition of constant bleeding, and she bears this burden of a chronic health problem and brings it to Jesus. Now, we can think of it in those terms, right? Because health problems can be heavy burdens in our lives. They are things that weigh us down. They are things that discourage us, and sometimes they're things that can even make us feel far from God. Things that make us, think that God is not concerned about my plight. Why does he allow me to suffer in this way? So we can think of this episode in that way, and Jesus lifts the burden by healing this hemorrhage of blood that has been going on for 12 years. But there's something else going on here too, and we should be aware of it. And that is, according to the law of Moses, that a Jewish woman who has an issue of blood is ritually unclean. She's not guilty of a moral fault, but there's a ritual uncleanness there. And what that means is that she would be forbidden to worship the Lord God of Israel in his temple. she would be forbidden to step foot in the Lord's sanctuary. So this is sort of like a woman who's so sick she hasn't been able to go to church for 12 years, all right, to put that in a modern context. That's what we're saying. She's actually cut off from full participation in the liturgical life of God's covenant people. That's the consequence of having an issue of blood for 12 years. So what does she do? She reaches out in faith. She says, if only I touch the hem of Jesus' garment. After all, this is a man who is enveloped in grace, and we see the power of God flowing into the world through him. All right, so she reaches out and she says, if only I touch the hem of his garment, or in the translation I'm reading, it's the fringe of his garment. Well, what is the fringe of his garment? Is that just the outer edge of it? Is it a sleeve? What are we talking about? Well, this is also something that is rooted in the Old Testament. The woman is probably reaching out to touch the tassel of Jesus' garment. I'm referring to a law that appears in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, chapter 15, beginning in verse 38. Listen to what the Lord tells Moses. He says, speak to the people of Israel and build them to make fringes or tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put upon the tassel of each corner a cord of blue. And it shall be to you a tassel to look upon, and remember all the commandments of the Lord to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to go after wantonly. So you shall remember and do all my commandments, and be holy to your God. So the fringes on Jesus' garment are precisely these tassels, what is known in the law of Moses as the tzitzit, the blue tassels on your garments that serve as visual reminders to keep the covenant, to observe the laws that God gives you, because those laws lead you to life. All right, and so it sort of casts a sidelight on Jesus as an observant Jew. Jesus is a devout member of the covenant people who has devoted his life to observing God's law, right? He is a faithful member of the covenant that God made with the people of Israel through Moses. And the woman reaches out to this tassel, this garment, this symbol of Jesus' own closeness to God, and she is instantly made well. Now, what are the lessons for us in this short episode? Well, I think there's sort of a theological message here, as well as a personal lesson that you and I can take with us as Catholic Christians. The theological message of this episode, I think, is wrapped up in verse 20, where it says that the woman had a hemorrhage of blood for 12 years. Now, 12 is a very significant number, you know. Jesus chose 12 disciples. Why 12 disciples? Because he was showing his contemporaries and those who lived in his own generation that he had come to regather Israel around the Messiah, right? He was coming to restore Israel. Now, curious thing. In Matthew's account, it says that the woman had a hemorrhage for 12 years and that a young girl died. But if you look at the parallel in the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Mark gives us an interesting detail that links these two episodes together. In Mark, we are told that the young girl who died, that is the ruler's daughter who died when she was 12 years old. So the number 12 is the significant thing here, okay? And it's kind of showing us that Jesus has come to heal Israel, that is to say, the whole tribal family of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. He's come to heal Israel, and he's come to bring life to Israel. Jesus has come to bring messianic redemption to his people. And I think that's signaled in the gospel writers by the number 12. That's the significant detail that kind of opens up some of the theological depths of meaning in these two short accounts. But what's the personal lesson for us? What do we take with us? Well, these episodes indicate that faith unleashes the power of Jesus into the world. All right, there is no limit to Jesus' power. As the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity and God incarnate, his power is infinite, right? It's not limited, in other words. However, the exercise of his power is limited by our faith. Too often by our faith. All right? And so we are invited to believe that Jesus has the authority to take our burdens away. Okay? He has the authority to release us from those things that weigh us down, things like sickness and like death. And that can be, of course, bodily sickness and bodily death, but it can also be spiritual sickness and spiritual death. That we are invited to come to Jesus believing with full conviction that He is able to take these burdens away from us, that He has the power to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. That's the power of Jesus that is activated in our lives when we come to Him with faith, when we reach out to Him and say, if only I touch the hem of His garment, I shall be made well. And Jesus can do precisely that. He can raise us up and He can make us well. I hope some of these reflections were helpful to you today. I pray that God blesses you, your family, and your day, and we'll see you here again next time. Thanks.